Archer Hayes spotted the glitch before that luxury jet ever left the tarmac. A tiny shudder in the backup pressurization system. The sort of detail wealthy passengers brush off to keep their tight schedules. He flatly warned Celeste Mercer that her plane should stay grounded. But the CEO just stared at his faded jacket and smiled coldly. Mocking him, she refused to lose a $100 million contract over a broke single father's worries. 20 minutes later, cruising at 30,000 feet, the cabin lights flickered. Cabin pressure dropped violently, ignoring any normal weather patterns, and the pilot started screaming for Archer. If you love seeing arrogant elites get humbled at 30,000 feet, you'll want to hear this entire story. Mason Ridge Executive Airfield rested on the western edge of town like a polished, exclusive secret. An exclusive strip of pristine asphalt where corporate jets gleamed under cold hangar lights, smelling of jet fuel and extreme wealth. The power players passing through these terminals were the type who never had to wait. They took business calls during quick pre-flight checks, whispering in the rapid shorthand of financial projections and midnight deadlines. They measured travel not in physical miles but in precious hours saved. They drove black, outrageously expensive vehicles. Their luggage was carried by others, while busy assistants trailed 3 steps behind, clutching glowing tablets and whispering updates. This hangar was never built for ordinary mechanics or working men with grease under their fingernails. And it made absolutely no effort to pretend it was. The runway's unspoken rule was simple: if you belonged here, you felt it. And if you didn't, everyone else noticed before you did. Archer Hayes pulled up in a beat-up truck from a bygone decade. It featured flaking paint, a mirror secured with black tape, and a massive dent showing the brutal history of someone else's terrible parking. He carried a battered canvas bag stuffed with specialized aviation tools. A bag that had been unzipped on oily tarmacs and in drafty hangars across 3 different time zones. He wore a faded jacket designed strictly to keep him warm, not to impress. He was lean, quietly athletic, with a calm in his eyes that did not come from a lack of feeling, but from years of mastering his emotions. To anyone peering from the glass executive lounge, he looked like a guy who parked in the wrong lot. But to anyone who had ever faced an emergency at high altitude, he was the only person on that entire airfield who actually knew how to fix a crisis. His daughter June had called him early that morning before he left for work. Currently studying 3 states away, she was incredibly blunt and direct. The exact way only kids of single fathers tend to be. She immediately asked the same question she always did before his high-profile maintenance jobs. Was he off to fix another multi-million-dollar toy for some arrogant rich person? He laughed softly, telling her that high-performance aircraft do not care whose name is on the deed. A leak in a cabin pressure line obeys the same physics, whether the plane costs $6 million or $60 million. And besides, he had been repairing machines long before wealthy elites started paying him to do it. June urged him to stay safe regardless, and he promised her he would. That was the total sum of any soft emotion between them. Simple, honest, and perfectly enough. The dispatcher for Mercer Aerodyne Group had summoned him early that morning to inspect a private Gulfstream jet before its morning departure. This luxury jet belonged to Celeste Mercer herself, the powerful CEO of Mercer Aerodyne. She was one of the biggest names in aviation tech and defense on the East Coast. Her company's crown jewel was Sky Shield, a revolutionary flight safety system valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. And Celeste was flying to Washington that very afternoon to lock it in, signing the massive deal to make her tech the new federal aviation safety standard. The clock was ticking down incredibly fast, and the stakes were higher than ever. But as Archer started inspecting the private jet's backup systems, he uncovered the exact problem he was really dreading. 3 minor readings were slipping: the backup cabin pressure cycle and a thermal valve signal in the rear bay, plus a rear sensor sending data that did not quite match up with the main computer. None of these tiny glitches would have triggered a red flag on a standard pre-flight safety checklist, because on their own, every single issue looked perfectly normal to her crew. But Archer did not look at them separately. He had worked on too many broken planes to know when weird readings were just a fluke, and when they were actually 3 warning signs of a deadly, hidden fault waiting to bring the plane down. He demanded a 90-minute delay. insisting that the regular hangar crew let him manually inspect the backup pressure system. The lead technician for Mercer's team pulled up the same numbers, just shrugged and said everything looked fine to fly. Archer warned that those limits were there to show normal wear and tear, not to ignore clear warning signs of trouble. The technician snapped back that the jet had to take off in under 2 hours. Archer replied that deadlines did not fix broken airplanes. Neither of them yelled, but the argument was over, and they both knew it. Just then Celeste Mercer walked in, striding into the hangar with the heavy confidence of a woman who had not been kept waiting by anyone in years. Sharp and commanding, her mere presence immediately demanded the full attention of everyone in the room. She wore her massive ambition like a shield, commanding respect without trying. It was not a performance, it was simply who she had become at the point. Behind her walked her assistant, Autumn Rodas, who was already on a phone call. Then her CFO Belle Dawson with her legal counsel Lawson Drake, whose jaw was tightly clenched, and her flight attendant Piper Sloan. Piper was the only person in the group moving calmly, looking completely unfazed by the rush, treating the whole ordeal as just another Tuesday. This was Celeste's own private orbit spinning with the ruthless speed of those who knew any ground time was a missed business deal. Archer stepped up and explained the danger to her in his usual calm, professional manner, laying out the facts clearly without any exaggeration, warning her that the backup cabin pressure was failing. The thermal switchover valve was lagging, and the aft sensors were spitting out data that completely clashed with the main cockpit readings. He wasn't saying the luxury plane was definitely going to crash. He was telling her that 3 critical systems were acting weird enough to warrant a quick check before climbing to 30,000. He recommended they delay the takeoff, investigate manually, and find the root cause first. But Lawson Drake spoke before Celeste could. He said the Sky Shield deal was set for 3 p.m., and rescheduling would give competitors an opening they wanted. Then Belle Dawson added, pointing out that 4 major bonuses were tied to a signature before the close of business that afternoon, meaning every hour of delay carried a massive, measurable cost. Archer waited for them to finish, then spoke with a patience that was highly practiced, saying he understood their financial pressure, but none of it changed what the backup pressurization system was currently doing. Celeste stared at him for a long, quiet moment. His dirty jacket, his old bag, his rusty pickup truck visible through the hangar doors, then asked if he understood the massive contract riding on this flight. Archer said yes. Then she asked if he had any legal authority to ground her plane. He said not if her own maintenance crew certified it. She asked why then he was still standing in her hangar. Because he hadn't been proven wrong yet, he replied, and 30,000 feet was a terrible place to find out those warning lights actually mattered. Celeste made her decision without any hesitation. She ordered her own maintenance team to officially clear the plane. And since they worked for Mercer Aerodyne, they knew exactly what was expected of them. They signed off on the jet, declaring it safe to fly. But Archer refused to sign a single thing under the charter rules. Since he had flagged a major issue and refused to clear the flight, he was required to accompany them on the flight. Celeste was told about this rule and reacted the way someone reacts, to a minor administrative hassle, with quiet irritation and the belief that she could easily deal with him once they were airborne. When Archer stepped aboard, Celeste made sure the cabin understood the harsh social hierarchy. She spoke loudly to Piper, making sure the entire row of colleagues heard that the mechanic must sit in the back, away from their meeting. She didn't mean to be cruel in the way petty people are cruel. She said it the way powerful people sometimes do, completely unaware of how much her words cut, because she had long since forgotten that people outside her wealthy circle feel pain just like she does. A few colleagues offered weak, forced smiles. Archer walked to the back, placing his worn bag near the technical bay access panel. He opened his tablet, tracking the secondary system data through the auxiliary feed. Piper watched him sit down, noticing something she had rarely seen before. A man who had been publicly humiliated yet didn't react with a single flinch. Not because he felt defeated, but because of something that looked like absolute quiet confidence. The luxury jet took off just before 2 p.m. The jet climbed into a heavy gray sky, surrounded by flat clouds stretching from horizon to horizon. The initial climb brought only mild, unremarkable turbulence. Just the typical bumps business travelers ignore and forget before the plane even levels off. Up in the cabin, Celeste rehearsed her Sky Shield presentation for the high-stakes Washington meeting. Her voice had the smooth, practiced tone of a CEO who had pitched this exact slide deck 100 times. Stripped to perfection. Her presentation outlined a smart safety system designed to catch mechanical failures long before they actually caused a crash. A system built to make the Galaxy future of flight much safer than anything we have ever seen before. But the bitter irony was not lost on the one man on board who had tried to do exactly that, only to be dismissed as just a useless mechanic. Archer quietly monitored the data feeds from the back of the private jet, keeping silent. At 12,000 feet, the rear thermal sensor drifted 2 degrees out of range for about 4 seconds before settling back to normal. At 18,000 feet, the cabin pressure system took 11 seconds to adjust, far longer than the standard 3 to 5. At 24,000 feet, Archer stopped tracking single glitches and focused on the dangerous pattern they formed. It was a terrifying pattern he had seen once before on a plane whose pressure switch had been fitted with a cheap part that was barely working but completely wrong for that aircraft system. Back then, he caught the error before the cabin lost pressure. He never expected to see it again. Instantly, he called Flight Attendant Piper to the back. Speaking in a low, urgent voice, he told her to alert the pilots right away. The pressure issue he warned about before takeoff had not cleared up. It was actually getting worse, and the flight crew needed to switch to manual pressure controls before they climbed any higher. Piper hesitated for a second. The CEO had made it clear that this mechanic's warnings were nothing but a massive annoyance. Yet the absolute certainty in his voice cut through her hesitation. She hurried forward. First Officer Bryce Langston took the message and glanced at his gauges with the annoyed look of a pilot asked to check something he already knew was fine. He told Piper everything was well within normal limits. From the back, Archer insisted that the captain get on the radio immediately. The co-pilot was annoyed by the demand, but Archer waited. Captain Garrett Holloway recognized the mechanic's name over the radio before the co-pilot even finished speaking. He had not heard that name in years. But names tied to men of that caliber, with that kind of quiet authority, don't just fade away. Garrett had been a rookie pilot a lifetime ago when things were messier, and the unsung heroes who guided you through a crisis never got their names printed in the company press releases. He quickly opened the secure channel and asked Archer what he was seeing. Archer laid out the critical system failure with his usual clinical precision. 3 separate systems failing as one single unit. The error was spiking the higher we climbed. The secondary pressurization switchgear was the most likely failure point. Climbing to 30,000 feet was dangerous, unless we cut the auxiliary circuit and broke this pattern. Garrett didn't say a word at first. Then he ordered Bryce to open the auxiliary board and check the switchgear sequence manually. Sure enough, Bryce found a tiny but very real deviation. He'd missed it earlier simply because no one had told him what to look for. Celeste glared toward the cockpit, turned to Piper, and demanded to know what the crew was doing. Piper explained that I had sent over an updated warning. Celeste's face hardened from mild annoyance to pure ice, and she shut down completely. But our jet kept climbing anyway. Then, just under 30,000 feet, the cabin lights flickered once. It was a tiny hiccup, the kind that would spark just 3 seconds of nervous tension before everyone shrugged it off as nothing. But on this private jet, my head snapped up from my tablet screen immediately, and my hand was already reaching for the auxiliary panel. Seconds after that flicker, the secondary pressurization system flashed from amber to red, then back to amber in a span of time too short to be a real fix but too glaring to be a simple sensor glitch. We hit a thick bank of clouds and the entire cabin began to shiver, with that familiar rattle of turbulence, and I understood right away that the shaking and the system failure were colliding in the worst possible way. The flexing fuselage was putting mechanical stress on a system already running on broken logic. I called Piper over, keeping my voice calm, and told her to tell the captain. Drop our altitude immediately and isolate that secondary circuit. Switch to manual pressure monitoring. Langston heard my warning but insisted again that everything was within normal limits. I demanded to speak to Captain Holloway directly. A long, tense silence followed before Garrett's voice finally came over the line. I warned him that if we hit 30,000 feet without cutting that circuit, the cabin pressure would lock up and force us into a terrifying emergency dive. Garrett asked me how sure I was. I told him I was sure enough that I didn't want my daughter reading about our crash on the news before I could call her. Piper, standing near the galley, froze right there. Garrett was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then, he started coordinating our emergency descent with air traffic control. He called it a precautionary check and diverted us toward Fort Anley Field to find a qualified avionics maintenance crew. Our jet finally started dropping altitude in safe, controlled steps. Celeste unbuckled and marched straight toward me at the back of the cabin, addressing me with an icy composure that was held together only by sheer practice. She hissed that I'd terrified her team for nothing and ruined her big Washington meeting. I looked her in the eye and said I hadn't disrupted her flight. The critical failure in her own secondary pressurization system did that before she ever stepped on board. Now, the only question left for us is whether she'd make it to Fort Anley alive. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the private cabin. Minutes ago, they were laughing. Now they were staring at the rising danger, realizing just how terrifyingly out of their depth they really were. Then the secondary cabin pressure warning flashed a second time. This time, the amber alert glowed long enough for 3 terrified passengers up front to see it. Nobody was smiling now like they had back in the hangar. Looking at Celeste, her arrogant, professional mask had completely slipped away. Beneath it was a woman realizing the horrific truth of what happens when a jet fails. The warning system she dismissed as a glitch was proving her dead wrong. Archer spoke into the backup channel, his voice calm, sharp, and steady. He guided the pilot through the complex isolation sequence, like someone who had done this in real combat. Not in a safe simulator, but where a single mistake meant instant death. Garrett flipped the switches, taking manual control of the cabin pressure. The warning light flickered off. The private jet finally steadied. In the tense silence that followed, the captain keyed the intercom. "Commander Hayes, I need you on this channel." Those words, "Commander Hayes," hit the cabin like an explosive drop in altitude. Celeste froze just 6 feet away. Beside her, the assistant recording the flight looked up in shock. The executive's smug face completely shifted. Watch how fast a smug executive's pride crumbles here. The man Celeste had banished to the back of her luxury jet, the guy she sneered at as just some grease monkey hired to fix trucks, was just addressed by her pilot with the rank of an elite military specialist. And the veteran pilot with 23 years of flying under his belt never threw around military titles. For the first time, Archer calmly walked to the front of the cabin, not to gloat or show off, but because the pilot desperately needed his expertise, and every second counted. He had the co-pilot open the main access panel and began inspecting the dangerous circuitry by hand. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The exact issue he had warned them about before takeoff at Mason Ridge. A crucial safety component had been swapped with a cheap bootleg part that only worked on paper. It was never built to handle the intense heat and pressure of this custom jet. Once the jet climbed past 20,000 feet, the air pressure began to crush it. The cheap part failed instantly, sending false altitude readings straight to the cockpit computers. It was a tiny error, but deadly enough to cause a catastrophic crash. It wasn't some loud, fiery explosion. It was the silent, deadly mistake made when greedy executives cut corners, buying cheap parts to save a few dollars. Archer calmly talked the pilot through a highly delicate emergency descent, dropping altitude slowly so they wouldn't tear the manual pressure seals apart. No sharp turns allowed, cutting their speed to protect the failing, overstressed systems. The veteran pilot followed every direction. This wasn't about pride anymore. In the end, we see that the man she dismissed as just a mechanic was the only one who could save them. That silent difference spoke volumes to both of them without a word. Over the cabin intercom, Garrett told Celeste exactly who this mere mechanic really was. He described Archer as a veteran commander in tactical aviation safety, advisor who had managed federal flight programs for over 10 years, a genius who literally wrote the crisis protocols for secondary system failures, and the legendary mentor Garrett had personally trained under during a classified era when the dangerous work and stakes were never hypothetical. He explained how Archer left active duty to raise his daughter after losing his wife, dedication keeping him bound to the only craft he had ever been genuinely brilliant at, spotting the fatal fault before the fault killed the plane. Celeste said absolutely nothing for a second. She turned to look at Archer from across the luxury cabin, her icy glare completely different from the arrogant way she had treated him in the hangar. The demanding authority she had thrown at him since they met still lingered in her posture, but it had nothing left to hold on to. The ordinary mechanic in the worn jacket, whom she had banished to the back of her jet, was now the only reason her failing pressurization system hadn't collapsed into deadly, uncontrolled chaos. Lawson Drake immediately tried to regain control. He insisted that all technical talk on board be silenced immediately to avoid legal exposure, demanding that all discussions about the dangerous malfunction be suppressed until Mercer's legal team could spin the narrative properly. Autumn Rhodes spoke up before Celeste could, citing strict federal aviation laws that mandated preserving all communication logs regarding this dangerous in-flight emergency. She spoke with a sharp precision, making it clear she spent the last 15 minutes preparing that exact response. Archer gave Lawson a brief, silent look, and the pure dismissal in that glance spoke louder than any argument. Lawson instantly understood that the man staring him down was not thinking about legal strategies. He was thinking about why a cheap, uncertified part had been installed on a luxury jet it should never have touched. Fort Anley Field finally materialized below through the parting clouds. Its single runway was flanked by hangars and a control tower that crucially housed a specialized avionics repair team. Garrett set the aircraft down with an incredible smoothness that proved both his pilot's skill and focused discipline of a professional who had just spent 40 brutal minutes guiding them through a deadly emergency. When the wheels finally touched the runway and they slowed down, not a single sound filled the cabin. No celebrating, no relief. Just the heavy silence of people who knew they had barely survived a disaster. Celeste stepped off the plane first, her posture stiff and her face a mask of cold composure. Because pride was the only shield she had left against her mistakes. The local ground crew spent the next few hours performing a meticulous inspection of the jet. Their official report matched Archer's diagnosis with the undeniable precision that shuts down all arguments. The critical secondary pressurization gear was a cheap, mismatched part bought from a supplier uncertified for this elite jet. Even worse, the control wiring in the rear technical bay was completely rerouted in a dangerous setup that completely violated the manufacturer's specifications. The maintenance logs were intentionally vague, clearly written to hide what they actually fixed and what they skipped. This was no random accident, it was bound to happen. This was the predictable disaster of a system that put cheap speed over human lives. Autumn Rhodes started building her case before that luxury jet even took off. She dropped the file right in front of Celeste inside a tiny airport office at the edge of the runway. The outfit hired to fix the cabin pressure system was Langston Avionics, a sketchy company personally hand-picked by executive Lawson Drake. Langston submitted a bid way cheaper than any certified competitor, promising a rush job that legitimate professional firms warned was impossible without cutting dangerous safety corners. They even ignored an active red flag on Langston's troubled safety record, burying the critical warning in an internal review and doing nothing. Bell Dawson dug into the finances of the shady deal and realized the savings from Langston had been cooked to make Mercer Aerodyne's pre-merger operating costs look way better on paper. That exact report had been passed around to the federal partners before they signed. The cost savings were real, but so was the deadly risk. Celeste cornered Lawson right outside in the hallway. He insisted the defect fell within a completely normal margin, and making a scene about it would cause more damage to the company than the actual issue. Archer overheard this on his way back from the hangar and froze in the doorway. He told them that in aviation, the phrase "within reasonable limits" was really only found in crash investigation records, long after the disaster had already occurred, and that the difference between a safe emergency landing and a tragic headline is just 45 minutes and one ignored warning. Lawson stared at him like a defeated executive who had tried to humiliate someone but completely ran out of ammunition. Pilot Garrett Holloway found Celeste standing by the tarmac as sunset cast long amber shadows across the runway. He did not approach her, as a captain addressing a wealthy passenger, but as someone carrying a heavy truth he could no longer keep to himself. He explained that Archer Hayes had cost himself his entire aviation career by doing exactly this, refusing to hide a deadly defect. He stood his ground and paid the price for being the most inconvenient man in the room. Archer did not lose his prestigious title because he was bad at his job. It was because he had repeatedly refused to sign off on a plane that was dangerous. And the greedy suits who wanted him to lie eventually forced him out of his career. He looked at her and said, "If you are still standing here tonight, it is because that mechanic stood up to you today, just like he always does, and did not back down when you made him pay the price to do so." Celeste Mercer had spent her entire life making high-stakes corporate decisions. Now her board of directors had called 4 times since the emergency landing, and every single call repeated the exact same terrified question: what happened? How exposed was her company now, and what was their official stance? Lawson had a prepared script ready. It blamed the emergency landing on bad weather and routine maintenance checks. It hid the cabin pressure failure and ignored the faulty avionics entirely. It used clever corporate spin to signal control without actually proving anything was safe. It was the classic kind of statement that corporate spin doctors call careful and calculated, but everyone else recognized as a shield to stop the next question. Celeste sat staring at the PR statement on the table, reading it twice. The copy was clean and the cover story held up. Technically, not a single sentence in this version was an outright lie. And a certain ruthless version of Celeste would have released it instantly, without any guilt, after spending 20 years in an industry built on spin, where controlling the narrative was seen as a vital executive skill. Just as she reached for the paper, Archer stepped into the doorway. Nobody invited him, and he certainly was not asking for permission. Looking at her and the paper, he reminded her she had barely survived ignoring his first warning. Did she really want to ignore the second warning he was giving her today? The warning about what happens when companies cover up fatal defects and pay the ultimate price. Celeste snapped that he did not understand the crushing pressure of leading an aviation giant the size of Mercer Aerodyne. Archer calmly admitted that was probably true. But he understood the pressure of making choices when getting it wrong meant people did not make it home. And it was that heavy pressure, not worrying about quarterly earnings, that taught him never to hide a mechanical fault. Lawson immediately pointed out that Archer had a military background. With highly suspicious ties, she should investigate before letting him influence this critical conversation. He hinted Archer had personal motives to disrupt their new contract, motives that had nothing to do with flight safety. Celeste looked back and forth between the two men, and the seed of doubt Lawson was planting found fertile soil to grow in, because she was exhausted, terrified, and not yet ready to realize that doubting this mechanic was completely absurd. Archer did not even bother arguing. He told her that if she wanted to fly to Washington tonight using that corporate spin, he was not getting on the plane. He also refused to sign any official clearance proving the private jet and its history were safe to fly. Then he grabbed his tool bag and walked out. 20 minutes later, Piper Sloan found Celeste still sitting at the table. She noted that during the terrifying crisis in the sky, she had watched how Archer spoke to the pilot with absolute calm and unwavering precision. He was not putting on a show for the executives, he was simply being completely competent. And their survival had not been a stroke of luck, but because the mechanic was right all along. Autumn Rhodes silently laid the official maintenance file on the table next to the PR statement, leaving Celeste alone with the truth and the lie. Celeste went ahead and issued the statement, but even as she approved the corporate spin, she knew in her heart that this crisis was far from over. That was the moment her carefully controlled crisis shifted, slipping into the shadows, getting far costlier. Her PR lie lasted less than 36 hours before it began unraveling. A technician at Fort Anley gossiped casually with an industry reporter. He revealed her multi-million-dollar jet never actually diverted for bad weather. A sudden cabin pressure failure raised questions a simple storm could never explain. Naturally, the press demanded answers from her elite aviation firm. Her PR team just repeated the same scripted corporate lie. So the press published a brutal article questioning why a safety-focused aviation giant was hiding a dangerous cabin pressure failure on the arrogant CEO's very own aircraft. Her elite Washington investors immediately called an emergency crisis meeting. They warned that if she could not explain the emergency landing technically within 24 hours, her multi-million-dollar defense contract would be frozen indefinitely. Two nervous board members called Celeste directly to warn her. They had been fed lies, and the massive disconnect between her statement and what the aviation industry was reporting was a massive cover-up, proving she had completely failed to lead. The crisis this arrogant CEO thought she could control was now entirely controlling her. Autumn hand-delivered the healer, damning maintenance files straight to Celeste's luxury hotel suite at dawn. She set it down gently, knowing these pages contained the ugly truth that would shatter her CEO's illusions. But the facts inside could no longer be ignored. The records proved her top executive, Lawson, had been warned about the cheap, faulty components, but signed off on them anyway, risking passenger lives just to save $1. Autumn warned that if Celeste kept lying to protect her corporate inner circle, she wasn't saving her aviation empire. She was covering for Lawson at her own company's expense. Meanwhile, the truth about Archer, the brilliant mechanic she dismissed, haunted her all night. Garrett had described how this veteran mechanic taught pilots to survive catastrophic system failures, guiding terrified flight crews through life-or-death emergencies when systems went dark. Archer had a quiet, unshakable confidence that could never be taught in a classroom. He simply refused to accept a single failure when human lives were on the line. Years ago, after a near disaster, the official report blamed a mechanical glitch instead of the pilot's fatal mistake. The mechanic quietly took the blame instead of fighting their corporate ruling, saving a pilot's career while sacrificing his own rise up the ladder. Eventually, he walked away to work quietly as a private hangar mechanic. He never asked for praise, even though arrogant elites slept soundly at 30,000 feet because of his tireless work in the hangar. The CEO was standing nearby, the maintenance hangar, when the mechanic's worried daughter called. It was a brief, ordinary call. June had heard rumors of the mid-air emergency. The humble mechanic assured her he was safe, everyone was alive, and it was over. He never bragged about forcing a dangerous flight to land. He didn't mention that an arrogant CEO insulted him, only to be proven dead wrong. He just smiled, said he was okay, and promised to call her back that evening. Celeste stood quietly in the shadows of the next room, listening to the man she belittled. Walking away, she finally understood something about Archer Hayes that a simple conversation never could have revealed. He did not need today's drama to be about him. He just wanted the aircraft to land safely. That was it, that was everything. That night, she called Lawson and told him they were scrapping the prepared statement for the morning. The video call with Washington partners. The board convened at 9 a.m. inside a borrowed conference room at Fort Anley. Monitors displayed the federal representatives, board members and independent safety partners, and the entire legal team for Sky Shield sat across a virtual table spanning 4 different time zones. Lawson had already rewritten his script. He prepared a new angle that he believed could still salvage their timeline, but only if Celeste stuck to the story about external factors. She walked into the room, glanced at the screens, and placed Lawson's document face down. She got straight to the point. She told the board her jet had suffered a secondary pressurization failure at high altitude. It was caused by an incorrect part installed during maintenance by Langston Avionics, a subcontractor hired solely to cut costs and speed, completely bypassing critical safety certification reviews. She admitted her pre-flight mechanic had flagged the issue before takeoff, and that she had personally ignored his warning to delay. Because of that, the failure happened at 30,000 feet, forcing an emergency diversion. She admitted their first public statement. From her PR team was a lie and she was correcting it. She refused to sell a high-tech safety system while covering up a major safety failure on her own plane. The conference room. On the other side of those screens went quiet, in that heavy way rooms do, when someone has just made a huge decision that can never be undone. Then Celeste invited Archer to present his technical findings. Lawson protested, arguing that Archer held no official title at the company. Celeste agreed, but added that he was the only one on that flight who valued safety over her schedule, which was exactly why she was letting him speak now. Archer explained the system failure without any added drama, the mismatched component, the delayed signals at high altitude, and how 3 separate backup systems masked one critical failure. He exposed the altered maintenance logs, written to hide the massive gap between what was done and what was required. He ended by saying this did not make their safety system useless. A predictive safety system was exactly what this industry needed. But the credibility of that system depended on whether their own company applied those same safety standards to their own jets, just like they expected from everyone else. A federal official who had remained silent during the presentation finally spoke up, asking Archer if he was the same commander. Hayes, who had consulted on the tactical aviation safety curriculum years ago. Archer confirmed his past role, but added that today the safety data mattered far more than any title. The representative silently took a note. Autumn then presented proof that Lawson knew about the maintenance hazard all along. Bell exposed the direct, greedy link between cheap maintenance savings and cheap maintenance contracts and their falsified financial reports. The board immediately voted to suspend Lawson Drake from the Sky Shield project, pending a massive investigation. Lawson packed up his papers. He walked out like a defeated man who realized none of his rich friends would save him. Soon, the corporate partners announced their decision. They wouldn't kill the Sky Shield contract, but they paused it for 30 days to audit Mercer Aerodyne's cheap, corner-cutting maintenance supply chain. No final signatures would happen without those results. During this freeze, they needed an independent safety advisor in charge, and they demanded that advisor be Commander Archer Hayes, the exact man the CEO once dismissed as just a mechanic. Celeste had to agree. When the screens went black, looking at Lawson's empty chair, she finally admitted the truth. The real betrayal was treating safety as a mere line item on a spreadsheet. And by accepting that greedy corporate logic without question, she had been just as guilty as he was. Over the next 30 days, Mercer Aerodyne underwent a brutal, rapid restructuring that shocked everyone who expected a long, drawn-out corporate battle. The corrupt supplier, Langston Avionics, was blacklisted and immediately reported to safety regulators to uncover years of their cheap, counterfeit parts. Lawson Drake quickly resigned, though his lawyers tried to spin it as a mutual departure. But everyone in the aviation industry knew he was completely finished. The deep safety audit exposed even more cheap, dangerous counterfeit parts hidden inside, neither as deadly as the pressure failure. But they proved Archer's warnings were absolutely right all along. The entire project was rewritten. New safety rules now required strict, independent double checks for any replacement parts used by outside suppliers. Supplier background checks became incredibly strict. The contract was finally signed 31 days late, packed with heavy safety oversight. Rules that once seemed like overkill now felt incredibly necessary to everyone who survived that terrifying near crash at 30,000 feet. Celeste did not suddenly become soft. She was still the same demanding, cutthroat leader who built a massive empire, because those traits were never the real issue. She had just prioritized corporate greed over human lives. Now she ordered that every single safety warning, no matter how small, must be fully documented and cleared by an outside expert before any jet can leave the ground. The directive named no names, it didn't need to. Archer turned down the high-paying executive job Celeste offered him. Instead, he only agreed to consult on his own strict terms, keeping his hands dirty. Exactly the quiet, honest life June knew he wanted. He didn't care about a fancy title. He didn't want the fake power that came with a corporate office. He just wanted to show up, save lives with his wrench, and walk away before they could turn a humble mechanic into a corporate legend. He found a fatal flaw and refused to back down. June came back home for a long weekend about 3 weeks after Fort Anley. Arriving late in the afternoon, she found Archer working in his small backyard workshop. He was rebuilding a fuel flow actuator from a twin-engine prop plane that he maintained for a flight school nearby. Sitting on an overturned crate just like she did at 12, she asked how that whole private jet situation turned out. He replied that his warning was ignored at first, until they finally listened. She asked if the wealthy CEO had apologized, and he said eventually. She joked that he had a real gift for making life-or-death situations sound completely boring. He admitted he preferred it that way. A few weeks later, Celeste herself showed up at his workshop. She was entirely alone, without the massive entourage that usually followed her around. No personal assistant, no strict schedule, and no protective shield. She held a photo of her multi-million-dollar jet, now fully repaired and officially recertified. Its dangerous cabin pressure system was rebuilt, and its maintenance logs were finally accurate. On the back, written in a hand she had not asked for but deeply appreciated, the pilot had penned a message. To Archer Hayes, the warning we should have heard sooner. Celeste quietly handed the picture over and reminded him of her words in the hangar, that he did not belong near her aircraft. She admitted she had been entirely wrong about what it actually meant to belong. Archer looked at the photo, stating that airplanes do not care who their mechanics belong to. They only demand that you are honest about the dangers you find. Passing the photograph back, he told her she should keep it, and she did. Before her next takeoff, Celeste walked the pre-flight safety line herself, something she had not done in years. She asked Garrett if every single warning flag from the latest inspection had been independently verified. He nodded. She then asked if any issues were cleared without physically checking them first. He said no. She lingered at the top of the air stairs for a moment before heading inside. Her pilot, watching her from the cabin door, whispered that Commander Hayes would finally approve. This CEO had once dismissed the warning of a struggling, single-father mechanic. She believed her immense wealth and high ambition placed her far beyond the reach of tiny mistakes. But at 30,000 feet, with the cabin lights flickering and the pressure dropping in a way no weather could explain, she learned the hard lesson that Archer Hayes had always known. The sky simply does not care about your corner office. And sometimes the only thing keeping you from a catastrophic crash is the warning of the very mechanic you looked down on.